Sometimes, when you listen to recordings of Bernhard Abramowitsch, you feel as if the performer and his piano have left the stage and left behind music in its purest form. The philosopher Schopenhauer wrote, "Music is the answer to the mystery of life, the most profound of all the arts." It is not a representation of ideas, but rather of the will itself.
Each person carries within them an entire universe, a universe of relationships, memories, ideas, and accomplishments. Once he or she is gone, that universe, or most of it, fades. Architects and carpenters leave behind buildings or kitchen cabinets. Others leave social movements or commercial enterprises. Abramowitsch left behind 3 boxes of tape recordings, boxes of newspaper clippings, programs, and photographs. And of course memories we formed during our time with him. But for some, his music has left an imprint that will never fade. This is my attempt to re-enter the universe of an extraordinary artist whose career was interrupted and reborn in another country, and who also happens to be my father.
When my mother and I emigrated, when we fled from the Nazis, I was 9 years old. And my mother at first felt quite lost in this strange environment. But one day came home exhilarated, having been invited by friends who, like her, had emigrated but earlier, who were very musical. And she told me excitedly that she met a wonderful pianist who was reading sonatas with a very young violinist named Isaac Stern. And Bernhard Abramowitsch was a name she already knew, and hearing them making music, getting in touch with him, clearly having a warm, immediate feeling of friendship for him, gave her actually hope that life in this country would be possible.
Only the faintest trail still remains. A case of lost records, questions never asked, and a desire to forget. We know that Bernhard's parents were married in 1899 in what was then Russian Odessa. In 1905, Odessa was shaken by a wave of Tsarist-sponsored violence against its Jewish population. It was probably the reason his parents left for a safer haven. Latvia. We don't know where they stayed or for how long, but political instability soon arrived there too. With their 2 sons, Jinya and Yasha, and a young cousin, they made a final move, arriving during 1905 in Germany. Bernhard was born on January 5th, 1906 in Hamburg. From then, through the early teens of the century, as compared to other European countries, Germany was the safest place for the family to settle, and it was an easier culture to assimilate into, even though the family still lived in relative poverty. At about 4 years of age, Bernhard began playing the piano. His older brother, Jascha, received lessons and taught for extra income. Bernhard, still a child, sometimes helped teach his brother's students. Germany emerged from World War I as a complex and volatile mixture of famine, hyperinflation, and artistic expression that often criticized Germany's militaristic past. Abramowitsch remembered the desperate days of 1923 when, between morning and evening, cash would lose all its value, causing people to sell whatever they had to buy food. The young Abramowitsch was formed by this cultural and economic turmoil even more deeply than he realized at the time. He went to public schools, learning German while the family still spoke Russian. During this period, Abramowitsch, now in his late teens, began attending the conservatory of Paul Strecker, one of an influential family in the German art and music scene. Shortly after his 21st birthday, in a concert of the top Strecker students, Bernhard performed for the first time in a major concert venue. In the next 2 years, he burst forth into a rapidly accelerating career. Abramowitsch has reached such maturity in his pianistic skills that he can, beyond all virtuosity, with his well-thought-out, internalized playing, exploit the ideas of the most diverse musical genres. We heard him here for the first time as a Bach interpreter, and were amazed to hear this artist, whose most personal area seems to be Chopin, recreate the spirit of Bach with his power of expression. Bach had, as it were, a comprehensive feeling for the nature of every instrument, and almost sensed the sound of our grand pianos today. A restrained demon lives in this work, a greatness of the inner sound imagination that is paired with an incomparable mobility of form. The pianist knew how to let this world arise in all its nuances, and earn the enthusiastic applause of the audience. Sometime around then, he was to meet Eva Koretz, a young pianist and organist who would, 10 years later, and in another country, become his partner and wife.
How did you actually meet?
I guess in one of those youth groups, and also in the Jewish group, I guess I must have. And then we saw each other here and there, and of course I went to all his concerts and sometimes turned his pages. And there was the music store, the Steinway music store. And I went in there and I told the man that in his store my husband's portrait was there. And that's how I saw him first, and that's how I fell in love with him.
The Weimar Republic, which had fostered a brief cultural opening, was demolished and fascist gangs roamed the streets. Books and arts deemed un-German were destroyed. Jewish shops were looted and burned. From 1933 onwards, Jewish artists were forbidden to perform for non-Jewish audiences. For a time, a Jewish cultural group was the only allowed venue, but it couldn't use the word German in its title. It became a hub of theatre, dance, and music. At Kulturbund events and its house concerts, Abramowitsch performed solo, in chamber recitals, and with its own symphony orchestra. But eventually, the Kulturbund was shut down too. It became clear it was time to leave. Bernhard Abramowitsch owes his honorable invitation to America to his great artistry, his mature ability and his rich creative powers, which he will already undertake at the beginning of November. With this last piano recital, his penultimate one in Germany, the great artist says goodbye to his friends in Lübeck. On November the 7th, 1936, Abramowitsch left Germany for the port of Antwerp, embarking on the steamship Ilsenstein for New York. Landing in New York, his entry to the US had been sponsored by a distant relative, Herman Bruckmann. Bruckmann, a well-known architect in Portland, Oregon, made his home Abramowitsch's first address in the United States. Portland was immensely hospitable to the young pianist, offering him performance opportunities and an entree to its social scene. He and Aoife Koret kept a regular correspondence. Their letters, often opened by censors, avoided naming the terrifying events happening in Europe, hoping only for a future in the new country. As an emergency refugee, Aoife was permitted to enter the United Kingdom in the spring of 1939. The conditions of her entry required her to participate in the war effort, and so she was trained in London and later sent to Edinburgh, Scotland, to work as a nurse. Meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, a concert had been arranged at Reed College, where Bruckmann's son Manny had been studying. It must have been at that concert where Abramowitsch met the eccentric musician and polymath, Raymond Smullyan. In 1939, Manny Bruckmann and Raymond Smullyan left Portland, accompanying Abramowitsch to look for opportunities in San Francisco. There are few details of the first days and months after their arrival in San Francisco. While Bernhard spoke only of a kind of footloose bachelorhood in the city, connections he must have made in Oregon began opening doors.
Among the first concerts I was ever taken to was when my mother took me to a wonderful house on Russian Hill. This was all new to us, where Bernhard was giving a series of recitals of all the Schubert sonatas. As you can imagine, they were pretty long for a 9-year-old, and I fell asleep sometimes, but this very personal relationship to Schubert, his expressive playing, has been with me all those many years. He had the luck of always having very impressed inhabitants of Russian Hill lend him a place to live while they were touring the world. And so this was in a beautiful house, and I still remember it and wonder whether it still exists.
In fact, the sponsors of these concerts were among the top San Francisco philanthropists and patrons of the arts. A lunchroom opened by Viennese immigrant Edith Schreier evolved into a boarding house across town. And then Bernhard's temporary home. Irene Schreier was their daughter.
Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but she was working terribly hard. We lived in a very slummy apartment that no longer exists.
It became a fascinating institution, a meeting point for émigré scholars and artists.
And I remember always coming home from school to an apartment with many, many people who were probably doctors, lawyers, and economists walking around slowly drying dishes and having important discussions about world events at that time.
Aoife was finally able to leave Britain and arrived in San Francisco in March of 1940. She and Bernhard were soon married. Their first child, Miriam, was born in November of 1941.
Well, this would not be a memory exactly, but we lived in this teensy little apartment in San Francisco. My bedroom was the entry hall, which was right next to the living room. So I would be in my crib in the entry hall with the door closed, and he was in the next room, in the living room, practicing and teaching. And so I was hearing his music from when I was born. And of course, I don't actually have memories of that. Something he told me. He was working with a singer, and she was singing a Brahms song called Der Schmied, which goes, Ich höre meinen Schatz. That interval, dum bum, which is a major sixth, I named that interval a Schatz.
As war raged in Europe, a steady stream of engagements in San Francisco, across the bay in Berkeley, and occasionally back in Oregon, solidified his reputation. Alfred Frankenstein of the San Francisco Chronicle and other music critics played a major role in developing his career. The Institute of Music at the University of California ended Wednesday night with the finest piano recital we have heard this year in the Bay region. It was given by Bernhard Abramowitsch, who is one of the foremost pianists residing on the West Coast and one of the most commanding figures in that field anywhere in the country. The Schubert B-flat Sonata is one of the most challenging compositions a pianist can tackle, and Abramowitsch provided the finest performance of it I have ever had the pleasure of hearing. This interpretive masterpiece was achieved through two devices: knowing the music and knowing how to play the piano. Abramowitsch is the kind of musician whose thought processes strike you as being essentially creative rather than presentative. There is a profundity about his work that makes each bar live afresh, and you never feel, as you sometimes do with others, that a line or phrase might have been more meaningfully conceived. Add to this magnificently brilliant technique, genuinely living rhythm which breathes rather than ticks, and complete effortless command of the shadings and sonorities of the piano, and the total picture begins to fill itself out. As his concertizing developed, he also began teaching at Mills College and at Holy Names College in Oakland, California. He accepted students from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and from the University of California at Berkeley, where he was a lecturer. In the late 40s, they bought a small property in the Berkeley Hills and built a house there. Their second child, Peter, was born in 1948. Meanwhile, Aoife pursued a life in painting and activism for peace, the environment, and racial integration.
This writer had the pleasure of spending several hours with Abramowitsch recently in his sunny living room overlooking the bay, with a huge grand piano in one corner covered with piles of music and books lining the walls. For he loves to read and once told a friend, "Sometimes I hate to practice. It keeps me from reading." Small and slightly stooped, with pale blonde hair and bright blue eyes under bristling blonde eyebrows, Abramowitsch is an exceedingly shy man who sometimes finds it difficult to put into words what he expresses so well in his music. A man of, at the same time, great humility and great pride. He is continually concerned with the problem of expressing fully the composer's intention in his music. I feel that you should not just express yourself. That was done too much in the 19th century and has been discredited pretty much, he says. But on the other hand, the objective approach that is so popular now is not possible either. The problem of notation has not been considered enough, he says. People take what is written as the complete music, but it is not. It is incomplete. He smiled. I've threatened my friends that I'm going to write a book on it for so long, they make fun of me by now.
When did I first hear Bernhard? It was, I think, at a concert, because I went to a lot of concerts as a young person, and might have been at the university, I'm not sure, but it also was at Margaret Ohl's house, my teacher, and it was with a young violinist, Nathan Rubin, who had just come back from Juilliard, and Bernhard played with him, and he was being introduced to people that Margaret invited there, because he was already very important to Berkeley and to our whole musical atmosphere. You know, he was already a legend in his very much in his time.
When I was 8 years old, my mother took me to Mills College, to the training school, so I could get clarinet lessons. And we were hanging around the music department quite a bit. And I saw Mr. Abramowitsch there. I saw him working in the big stage with other students and with the faculty. Later on, I went to college, came back, and went to graduate school at Mills College, and took chamber music from him. And that's when I first met him formally.
Well, I just first came to America to study. It was my freshman year. I was 19 years old. So the impression I got from him was, oh, he's not that tall. So that's the first thing. And then he's so kind. So he doesn't have any air. You know? So it is immediately I was attracted by his whole demeanor and also by his sort of the humility that came through. He is the best teachers among all my teachers, and I have many, many teachers in my life. And I said that because he opened up my whole understanding of what music is about. Instead of thinking of music on the score, and you have to do exactly what the score tells you to do, the notation, you have to go behind the notation. So the most important thing is the life inside. And so in performance, for example, instead of looking for accuracy, looking for perfect interpretation of a piece, you look for spontaneity. You look for the freshness, as if this was your first time playing the piece.
And another thing about Bernhard's playing was that it was so articulate. It was clear. The musical mind was very clear, obviously, in the phrasing. It wasn't just all beautifully mushed together. It was very, very articulate and clear with character. And that was one other thing that Casals would constantly say something. Don't just play notes, say something. And that was so clear in Bernhard's playing. It was such a joy to hear him.
Yes, that Wanderer Fantasy recording is remarkable. The energy and the spirit in it is just unmatched. Now, he didn't care a hoot about wrong notes, and he doesn't play that many wrong notes, but with him, the spontaneity is just tremendous. And it's as if he's making it up as he's performing it. He always used to say that he would study a piece as much as he could, but then when he got to perform it, he would try to forget everything that he did and just build it all up from the beginning as if it were the first time he had played it. understood something very profound about melodic construction, and the way he handled melodies rhythmically really brought you to a different level of understanding as to what that melody was. And it was like magic. There was really a magical element in the way he put together details.
I don't know how it was for his other students, but for me working with him, when I was singing and we were working together, he was my accompanist and I was singing, it felt like it was something that I sort of was born with, sort of like another version of Mother's Milk or something. So it's not, the basic, it's not the tempo, it's not and not a rigid beat, it's micro flexibility. So no two beats are alike. But in the music you were playing, the Haydn movement that you were playing on the film, it was very obvious, what he was doing with the rhythm. It was, I could just hear it, like he would spend just a tiny bit more on the downbeat than on the next beat or two.
Of course, the first things that come to mind are my later connections with Bernhard when I was already at least on the way to becoming an adult and interacting with him musically, being enormously impressed by his really, I would say, unique attitude toward music in a very personal way, at the same time intellectually very firm. The combination of the freedom and the discipline made an enormous impression on me.
His researched but unwritten book intended to reveal the magic that critics described as alive, profound, deep.
The word rubato in Italian means stolen, and in music it's referring to stolen time. So it means if you're staying, if you steal some time and make one note longer, then you have to make the next note shorter in order to, fill the same amount of space.
It embodies a delicate interplay of rhythm and melody, voice and silence that has no fully symbolic representation. He conjures the essence of the music into being with a flexibility of time and dynamic that varies literally from beat to beat. Watch how absolute time and performed time vary in this small passage from Beethoven's Sonata, Opus 109.
During later years, that is after I had moved away from the Bay Area and was here on visits, we had many meetings at the piano. He was always very kind to invite me to come to play for him. And then what wasn't specifically a lesson, going through the score, going through the music with him, occasionally the joy of playing four hands with him are the first things that come to my mind.
Bernhard performed the complete piano works of Schubert and Beethoven on radio station KPFA in the years 1955 to 1957. The masters of these tapes have long since disappeared, but copies form the core of the performances you can now hear online. His concerts became infrequent, but continued with extraordinary reviews, focusing on the compositions he considered essential. He continued to teach out of his home and play chamber music with his friends. Although the book never materialized, the notes for it remain. Bernhard and Aoife became grandparents. In what must have been emotional reunions, they reconnected with remaining family and friends in Europe. Bernhard continued to visit with his friend from 1938, Raymond Smullyan, who had become a world-famous author and logician. Larry London's surprise gift at one of Bernhard's monthly student gatherings captures perfectly the private Abramowitsch, seen frequently in Berkeley in his faded corduroys and wrinkled shirts, with his $10 pocket watches and his extraordinary eyebrows.
When you hear those players, you know when you hear them recorded or so, you know who they are. They're distinctive in their musical personality. Bernhard had that in spades. When I hear now, and I love it because, of course, it's years since we actually had him with us, to play. You know who that is. It's just very distinctive. And so it's a musical, I guess I call it a point of view because that's who he is. It's not a thought. I mean, it's his musical intellect, it's his musical feeling, and it's his musical intuition and his musical connection, the connection where he's really connecting with the composers, and that spirit of the composer is coming through him. He tapped into something deeper. It's where the ones that had that real element of greatness, that it was part of who they were as musicians.
Abramowitsch did leave the stage, unexpectedly on October the 15th, 1986, and left behind music in its purest form.
Abramowitsch was taciturn not only in public, but even as a father. It would have been up to me to ask the questions that would have filled in the gaps. He never sat me down to say that he was on the way to becoming one of Germany's most famous pianists. He never pointed me to his extraordinary reviews, many of which I only read a half-century later. The curiosity in me wasn't yet ready during his lifetime. As far as I know, there is not one surviving recorded or filmed interview. It is his music that speaks. I hope it communicates that the notes on a musical score, like the shoeboxes of negatives and clippings, are only an incomplete guide to a universe that exists somewhere in space and time. Each of his recorded performances is also a small universe which I hope you will enjoy for a long time to come.